As both Russia and Ukraine are exhausted, the Ukraine conflict has reached a critical stage. An estimated plus 200,000 soldiers are dead on both sides. Many times more than that number would have been wounded, missing from action, or have lost their will to stay in the fight. 12 months of war is not a great journey to undertake. Russia waged an unwinnable war. It is now fighting to protect one man's ego, pride, and life. Ukraine is in this war because countries cannot choose their neighbors. They have learned to live with them. Sans the minor loss of Soledar to Russia, the entire front line in Ukraine that runs for more than 900 kilometers is stuck in an operational stalemate. Neither side has the energy or the resources to move the front line. Russia and Ukraine do not want to waste their resources during the winter. Both sides are trying to exhaust each other in order to deny them the opportunity to regenerate capacity and mount a summer offensive. We can call this phase of the war as denial. Hold your ground. Keep the other side exhausted. Russian strategy over the last 3 months will not work in the next 3 months. The two counteroffensives that resulted in territorial gain for Russia, Popasna and Lysychansk in July 2022 and Soledar in January 2023, was made possible because of the Yevgeny Prigozhin-led Wagner Group, the mercenary group that is fighting for Putin in Ukraine. The Wagner Group recruited prison inmates to fight in Ukraine. They were promised freedom. But the reality was, they were treated as expendables. Wave after wave attacks were mounted on Bakhmut, draining copious amounts of Ukrainian resources. Russia assumed that Ukrainian army will never be able to match the high human cost they were willing to pay in order to capture Bakhmut. The Ukrainians refused to give up, thus increasing the human cost for the Russians. The Wagner Group, which promised freedom for prison inmates, then promised them eternal freedom with bullets if the inmates tried to run. A lot of them surrendered to the Ukrainian army, and the Wagner Group promptly refused to take them back. The group used prison inmates as use and throw body bags. It was a forced suicide mission for many of the prison inmates. A lot of them would have never signed up had they known they are being thrown into the meat grinder with a sole purpose to slow down the grinder and not to win. The Wagner Group is now close to exhaustion. Reports indicate thousands of Wagner Group soldiers have died in Ukraine. The growing size of the Wagner cemetery is clear evidence of the steady escalation of deaths. Words spread fast. Pictures spread faster. Conventional Russian forces are likely replacing exhausted Wagner Group forces to maintain the offensive in Bakhmut after the Wagner Group's offensive in Bakhmut culminated with the capture of Soledar around January 12. ISW. The pace of prison inmate sign-ups must have plummeted. The news of more than 100,000 dead Russian soldiers would have reached all corners of the Russian society. Social media would have made most Russians well aware of the number of Russian men who ran out of the country to avoid master strategist Putin's half-baked military recruitment order. 12 months is a long time to hide the pumpkin under the dining table. Someday people are going to know it was right there all along. Expendable recruitment will become extremely hard from here. I think it has already nosedived. The Wagner Group has not been able to replace dead inmates with live ones. Russian conventional forces are filling up positions held by the Wagner Group in the Bakhmut region. The only plausible reason for this, the group is not able to regenerate force that it is losing in the war. How does the loss of Wagner Group impact the war? The group will try to maintain some operational presence in the war because their leader Prigozhin is not in the war to win it for Russia, he is in it so that he can further improve his stature and have a formidable presence in the right-wing nationalist Russian circle. But the impact this group had on the war is starting to decline, changing the operational dynamic of Russian forces in Ukraine. Without the Wagner Group's array of expendables, who can be thrown into difficult-to-win situations, the Russian army will find it extremely hard to drain Ukrainian resources. If resources are not drained, Ukraine will start moving them towards liberating territory occupied by Russia, or they will use it tactically to affect the supply routes feeding the Russian army. Lack of Wagner's resources in the battlefield will force the Russian generals to wage a conventional fight with Ukrainian army. The entire world knows tactics, and Russian army behave like water and oil. You can drop them on top of each other, but they just won't mix. The only strategy available to Russian generals is to destroy human centers and break down their opponents' will to subdue them. That is what they did in Chechnya. That is what they did in Syria. That is what they tried and failed to do in Ukraine. The Russians couldn't deploy their indiscriminate expansion of the cemetery strategy in Ukraine. It was the first time that the Russian army faced an army with better weapons, tactical superiority, and high morale. When given the choice between a small but high morale army and a large but low morale army, I will always opt for the former. At least if I am going to be entering into a difficult-to-win battle, I would rather be with mates who are wanting to fight and not with men who are complaining about everything they can see, touch and feel. The loss of Wagner Group will have a destabilizing effect because the Russian army will now be brutally exposed on the front lines. They will have to fight with their brains, not with borrowed bodies. Russians will experience a drastic change in the landscape of Ukraine after the arrival of 321 Western tanks and fast-moving armored vehicles. It will turn into a hellscape. Since the start of the war, the West has supplied Ukraine with weapons in the last minute. They were mostly defensive in nature. This will be the first time heavy weapons are being sent to Ukraine. I am not sure how many units can be formed using 300 tanks and hundreds of armored vehicles. Ukraine uses a highly decentralized structure, so it will be very difficult to predict. However, we can expect Ukraine to now be able to attack Russia from multiple angles, instead of just concentrating on one section. Even when Ukraine attacked at one location at a time, the Russians were unable to respond. In the face of a highly centralized Russian army, a decentralized Ukrainian army will send their brains into a tailspin. Imagine multiple pack of ants going after a large crocodile. Defending against such a force is hard, but at least it's still better than trying to play offense. Russia's best path to seek armistice is to capture strategically important locations before the arrival of Western tanks and then pivot to strong defense. If they were smart, they would have created multiple layers of defense at the front lines to stop the Ukrainian army from moving into their lines. Russians only have a very small window of opportunity to do so. It would be ideal if it could be done within the next 2 to 3 weeks. 20 days into the war, on March 15, 2022, I wrote that Russia will not capture Kyiv. It wasn't a popular opinion at that time because Russia was the second most powerful army in the world and Ukrainians are just Ukrainians. They were supposed to lose. But I had a different opinion because the Russians were overstretched. They sent 80% of their combat-ready force, an estimated 150,000 soldiers, and they tried to create a front line that stretched from Kherson in the south, all the way to Kyiv in the north. That is a front line running more than 1,500 kilometers. Russia did not have enough soldiers to man the front line. They certainly did not have the strength to capture Kyiv. In order to capture Kyiv, they would have to lay siege and then drain Ukraine, day after day, week after week, month after month. Putin will need a lot of resources to accomplish that. Now, I am making a very similar case. Putin does not have the strength to expand territory and then pivot to defense. Their original army has long gone. More than half of the Russian army that went into Ukraine last year is dead. The Russian army is being filled with new recruits. If Putin tries to capture more territory, it will come at a huge cost, both human and ammunition. Ukraine will play defense, conserving energy, waiting for the offensive formations to be built using Western tanks and armored vehicles. For the first time ever, a rejuvenated and offensive-ready Ukrainian army will face an exhausted Putin's army. It's a recipe for disaster for Putin. His best bet, as I have written so many times before, is to further shrink his occupational footprint in Ukraine. It is impossible for him to hold on to the land he currently holds. The next 4 weeks could very well be Russia's final offensive. Ukraine may lose some land during this period, but the harder Russia pushes over the next few weeks, the faster Putin's army will collapse in the summer.